It's the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
You are Locked On Saints, your daily New Orleans Saints podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is good, Who Dat Nation and Who Dat family? Welcome into another episode of Locked On Saints, the daily podcast covering your New Orleans Saints, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. On today's episode, we're going to start off with the big news: Patrick Robinson retiring a New Orleans Saint after 11 years in the NFL. So that means it's time to update the 53-man roster, particularly the cornerback position. We'll talk about which players currently on the roster I think can now make the roster, and of course, we'll take a look at some trade targets for the New Orleans Saints as well, all before taking a look at some of the biggest things you need to know from training camp day 11, including a big day from Taysom Hill, 2 early exits that you need to worry about, and a couple of rule changes or rule news pieces from the NFL that are relevant to the New Orleans Saints and New Orleans Saints fans. As always, I'm your host, Ross Jackson, at Ross Jackson Nola on Twitter, co-managing editor over at CanalStreetChronicles.com, and your Tuesday co-host over the National Locked On NFL podcast. We got all that and a little bit of lanyard for you on today's episode of Locked On Saints, your team every day. All right, Phil, let's go ahead and get right into it. The big news from Tuesday: Patrick Robinson, who was presumed to be a starting quarterback for the New Orleans Saints, announcing his retirement after 11 seasons, 16 career interceptions, over 80 pass breakups, got a couple of sacks, and then quite a few tackles up in there as well. But he started his season the first year of his career with the New Orleans Saints, a first-round draft pick, ended up moving on to a couple of other teams, including the San Diego Chargers, but of course, most notably, the Philadelphia Eagles, were returning to the New Orleans Saints just a couple of years ago, and then now is calling it quits with the New Orleans Saints, and he will retire with the team that drafted him in the midst of all of this, and officially gets rid of the oldest player on the New Orleans Saints roster, so he is no longer going to be there. Therefore, he's no longer the oldest player that's on the roster. So for the New Orleans Saints, yes, this does put them in a bit of a predicament, because now they went from having at least an option at the starting cornerback position opposite Marshon Lattimore to not having a fully understood option at this point opposite Marshon Lattimore. It looked like Patrick Robinson was going to be the starting cornerback, which most of us really expected anyway, opposite Marshon. And then, of course, we don't know if Marshon Lattimore is going to be suspended to start the season and if he himself will even be available to start the year. So all of that still to be determined. And so it adjusts the way that we look at our 53-man roster, which we're going to update here in just a second. But it is worth mentioning that there's no right time to retire. I've seen some people who have asked the question, why retire now? This is really inconvenient, things like that. It doesn't matter. When you decide to retire from the NFL, it's the right time to retire from the NFL. It's just that simple. But all that said, yes, it does put the New Orleans Saints in a bit of a sticky situation. It certainly raises the urgency when it comes to trying to fulfill the position opposite and also potentially in place of Marshon Lattimore at that cornerback spot. So a couple of names to know, of course, would be Paulson Adebo, rookie corner drafted in the 3rd round out of Stanford. He really has been coming along a little bit quicker than I thought that he would. And y'all know I am very high on Paulson Adebo. I think the guy can be really, really good in the NFL. Great ball skills, understands route concepts, understands wide receiver play, great at attacking the ball. He does a lot of things very well. Has some things to continue to work on, but he has really performed, including having an interception again on Tuesday off of a pass that was batted at the line of scrimmage. Got in position to pick that one off. 6'1", 190 plus pounds, definitely fits the prototype as well. Ken Crawley, of course, having a great camp, but can it translate to the regular season? He's somebody that I had just as much sort of, or I guess I will say I have just as many reservations about as a 17-game starter as I had about Patrick Robinson, but he is having a great camp so far, and the confidence, which was a big issue for him after his great rookie season, has definitely gotten back up, it looks like. And then, of course, the new signings, Prince Amukamara as well as Brian Poole, both of them now, their doors help to open up a bit more, and they have a bit of a clearer path to the roster. So now we're going to take a look At the 5 corners that I think are going to make the roster for the New Orleans Saints, I'm going to go Marshon Lattimore to start. He hasn't been suspended yet, so that's why I still have him listed here. Paulson Adebo, CJ Gardner-Johnson, then Ken Crawley, and Brian Poole. I'm going to take Brian Poole to be the guy that moves into the, not really necessarily into a role, but moves into making the roster now, because he's somebody that could very easily be a dime back for you, which was a role that Patrick Robinson played when he wasn't starting in place of an injured corner. Then I think Brian Poole makes a lot of sense in your ability to be able to utilize him in congested areas and close to the line of scrimmage. Now, if Marshon Lattimore ends up being suspended, maybe that opens the door for Prince Amukamara. I haven't listed Bryce Thompson here, the undrafted free agent out of Tennessee, because he's mostly been playing safety. So opening up the defensive back spot could end up working for him. He could even be directly competing with a guy like PJ Williams, who's been injured or let me not say injured, who's been unavailable for the past few practices. We don't have details on that yet. So he could be somebody that could play corner and safety that could be competing with PJ Williams for a roster spot. So I put him in a different category than these corners. And of course, I include CJ Gardner-Johnson as a corner and not as a safety. Some people would look at that differently. So that's the way that I kind of look at this for the New Orleans Saints. And if Marshon Lattimore ends up being suspended, he could potentially end up being replaced, so that role could be filled by somebody that the Saints grab from outside the facility, who could then shift to cornerback 2 once Marshon Lattimore makes his return. So let's identify those players, specifically 2 that we want to make sure that we're keeping an eye on as we continue on with today's episode of Locked On Saints. And before we get to that, I want to let you know today's episode is brought to you by our good friends over at betonline.ag. You can go ahead and get in on early season win totals. If you want to take a look at where the New Orleans Saints are there and place a bet either way, you can get in on some of the early game of the year lines that are already out there. Which team is favored? You want to bet for the underdog? You want to go ahead and throw some money down on the favorites? You can do parlays and go for several favorites as well. Lots of different ways for you to get involved over at betonline.ag. Even if you don't want to bet on sports, there's award shows, there's game shows, there's reality TV shows, a bunch of stuff you can also get in on as well. Once again, it's over at betonline.ag. Free to sign up. And then when you put down your first deposit of money that you use to bet with, then go ahead and use the promo code LOCKEDON, LOCKEDON, so you can get a 50% welcome bonus on your first deposit. That's a 50% welcome bonus with the promo code LOCKEDON over at betonline.ag. BetOnline, your online sportsbook experts. All right, family, continue on with today's episode of Locked On Saints. Of course, we talked about the Patrick Robinson news, calling it quits after 11 seasons in the NFL. Certainly, we thank him for everything that he has done for the New Orleans Saints. I know it was a bit of a turbulent career and turbulent time with New Orleans, but last year he did some really great things for them, and he certainly helped to coach up some of the young guys that are in the New Orleans Saints cornerback room right now, which they can expand with another young guy, or they could go with another veteran. So let's talk about 2 potential trade targets for the New Orleans Saints. According to Jeff Duncan at JeffDuncan_ on Twitter, the New Orleans Saints are exploring open options on the open market when it comes to the trade market, and CJ Henderson seems to be one of the players that they have inquired upon. Doesn't mean that they're interested, but that they've inquired upon. Now, there have been a lot of certain conversations around CJ Henderson about character concerns and things like that. He showed up to training camp for the Jacksonville Jaguars and immediately had to be moved to a reserve list for 10 days after testing positive, and then has also missed some other situations and things like that. But everything that I've read so far calls them personal issues, but then doesn't go any deeper into what that means. And that's context that I feel like is really important, right? Because if those personal issues are in line with things like Grant Haley, who missed the early portion of training camp for the New Orleans Saints because of a death in the family, that's a very different connotation than somebody missing practice because they felt like it. And a lot of the tone, if you kind of read in between the lines of some of the things that have been written about CJ Henderson, seems to allude to the fact that he has character concerns and has just kind of like gone AWOL all on his own, and that he's been shadowed by conditioning coaches that have watched him every step of the way through his practices, or through his conditioning training, which conditioning coaches do. So I don't really know where to go here. All I know is that if there is a situation that is unfit for CJ Henderson in Jacksonville, getting to a situation and a culture or a team culture that is a little bit more fit for whatever it is that he needs might be the right way to go for him. The New Orleans Saints potentially could be that. New Orleans Saints will certainly be a good scheme fit, as we talked about yesterday. They ran man coverage 47% of the time. CJ Henderson, a man coverage corner. The Jacksonville Jaguars last year in the top 10 in man coverage percentage, which fit CJ Gardner-Johnson's play style. But now with them bringing in a couple of other guys, he might end up getting pushed behind a little bit. Tyson Campbell, a very good cover corner. And then, of course, they went out and spent some money at the cornerback position and kind of revamped the secondary as well. And maybe they'll end up going to some more zone looks that don't fit CJ Henderson's skill set. So certainly the skill set and the traits would fit in New Orleans, and he is a prototypical corner. And of course, you have a former Florida Gator, two former Florida Gators, but one former Florida Gator teammate in CJ Gardner-Johnson that would be there to welcome him with open arms, most assuredly. So that may also help his situation too. If he's just unhappy where he is and wants to be somewhere else, gives him an opportunity to do that. Certainly for the New Orleans Saints, not a bad route to go to trade for a guy like CJ Henderson, who's still on a rookie deal, only the second year of his rookie deal. So he's cheap. That allows you to save the money that you would need in order to pay a guy like Marshon Lattimore or even Marcus Williams last season. The other option would be to go for a veteran corner in the market in Stephon Gilmore, who right now would carry a $7 million cap hit for any team that acquires him, basically. But will he play on a $7 million price tag in 2021? Seems unlikely, so you might have to give him a new deal, but you would have control over how that deal affects your accounting, what the salary cap is versus what the cash is, all these other pieces of the conversation that are more nuanced than what we have time for today. But we know how the New Orleans Saints manipulate the salary cap and work with contracts to make them team and player, let's say player appropriate, but team friendly. Let's say it that way. And so there are ways for the New Orleans Saints to do that. That feels like a little bit more of a win now move, as Deuce Wyndham and Matty Hudak and I discussed on Tuesday night's Hudak Confessional. It's a little bit more of a win now move, right? To bring in a veteran guy that's probably going to be in your team for a year, maybe 2 years if you end up giving him a little bit of an extension to give him more money, kind of the Janoris Jenkins approach, for instance. They could go that route. They could go the young route, which allows you to pay some of the other players on the team. There's a couple of different ways you can go for it. You're kind of bringing in a guy like CJ Henderson, though, or you're bringing in anybody that's any more refined or proven than a guy like Paulson Adebo, another young corner, had you already have on the roster? I don't know, right? So that would be the question that the New Orleans Saints would have to answer in terms of trying to find somebody that is able to come in and contribute immediately as a starter. Now, the Saints could also just focus on who they have in the building, maybe add to depth quite a bit with a player that they like, a guy like Drake Kirkpatrick, who the Saints have tried out. Garyon Conley's still on the market. The Saints could also look to see who gets cut. Remember, there's 5 players cut from every team around the NFL after the first preseason game, 5 more around every team in the second preseason game. And then after the third preseason game, you go from 80 to 53. The Saints could potentially end up getting involved in a more active trade market at that time for a team that's trying to return assets for a player that they might otherwise release or maybe choose not to release if they can't get those assets. Or, of course, they could just kind of go and scrounge the market to see who becomes available. And remember, there's a week off in between the final preseason game and the first week 1 game as well. So unsurprising at all, would it be to see the Saints have a 53-man roster initial that is different than the 53-man roster week 1. So we'll see how all of that goes. But lots of avenues for the Saints to take. Do you invest the players that you already have in the building? Do you wait and see who becomes available on the open market? Or do you go out and try to find yourself a starter now in the trade market? A lot to figure out for the New Orleans Saints there. Coming up next, though, I want to talk a little bit more, open the scope a bit, and talk about some of the big stories that you need to know from training camp day 11. Big day from Taysom Hill. A couple of early exits that have me a little concerned, and some big NFL rule updates that you need to know about as we continue on and wrap up today's episode of Locked On Saints. And of course, today's episode is brought to you by our good friends over at BuiltBar.com, the best tasting protein bars on the market. And usually now is when I tell you about the 9 incredible flavors that they have. But right now I'm going to tell you about the one and only flavor that you need to know about. That is Rocky Road. Chocolate, marshmallow, brownie, whatever it is that you love, it's in the Rocky Road bar. I love Rocky Road ice cream, so I'm super stoked about these Rocky Road Built bars. They're available for a limited time right now, so go and check them out at Built.com. You can check out the Built bars there as well as all the other products that they have, but I definitely recommend that you jump on these Rocky Road Built bars right away before they are gone, because they very likely, just like all the other limited edition flavors, will go quickly. So go and check them out at Built.com. Don't forget to use the promo code LOCKED15, LOCKED15, so you can get 15% off of your next order at Built.com. That's promo code 15 at Built or at BuiltBar.com. Let's get it. Who Dat Nation, wrapping up today's episode of Locked On Saints. Want to talk a little bit about training camp day 11, give you some of the news and notes that you need to know, some big highlights there. But first, want to tell you about some rule updates, some rules that you need to know about for the NFL. First of which is an unchanged rule that I think is really, really, really helpful and beneficial, not only for the New Orleans Saints and New Orleans Saints fans, but across the NFL. Something that I hope actually never changes. I hope this stays permanent. The IR rules from 2021 for 2020 are officially carrying over to 2021. So unlimited number of players can return from injured reserve once put there, and it only requires a 3-game absence as opposed to an 8-game or 6-game absence, whatever it was before. This is much, much better and something to keep in mind. So let's say that Michael Thomas ends up showing up for stretch one day at practice and then doesn't end up carrying over on the physically unable to perform list to start the season. And instead, he makes the 53-man roster and the Saints move him to injured reserve. The good news there means that they're looking at less than 6 games, which is how long it would take to get, or 6 weeks, which is how long it would take to get Michael Thomas back off of the PUP reserve list. And instead, you could potentially see him come back after 3 games. That would be an indicator of the Saints expecting him to get back quicker than possible. I don't know if that's going to happen, but just as an example, because he's somebody that's dealing in, that's in that situation. But this is good news. New Orleans Saints, all the teams around the NFL should love this. The option to be able to move players to injured reserve for 3 weeks and then take them off and give them the time that they need, but not end their season, basically, once you're halfway through. This is really, really good stuff for the NFL. And I hope that they never change this. I hope that this never changes. Something that I hope changes very quickly, though, is this stupid rule, which is that the New Orleans Saints are going to be the NFL is going to be cracking down on taunting. Can I just for a moment, this drives me nuts. This is a game where men are paid to hit each other. And we're upset because one of them might say something mean or wave their hand in their face or talk trash to them or whatever. And by the way, trash talk and taunting are 2 completely different things. Trash talk is a part of the game. Taunting is not. And I'm worried about this rule because a guy like CJ Gardner-Johnson, not that this rule is entirely about him, but a guy like CJ Gardner-Johnson is going to carry a reputation amongst all of these subjective referees that are going to be, or officials rather, that are going to be making these judgment calls about what is taunting and what is not. Is flexing after scoring a touchdown taunting? Is Tyreek Hill throwing the peace sign after he burns everybody down the field taunting? Probably. So where do we draw the line here between taunting and celebration, between trash talk and taunting? I don't like this. So I'm sorry. I know I'm being mad dismissive about this, but I don't like this. I think this is dumb. Why are we taking fun out of the NFL again and turning it into the MLB where everybody's turning their nose up and everything's so buttoned up? People get in trouble for flipping bats and smashing grand slams when they're up 8. Who cares? Why do this? Just leave this alone altogether, Roger, you nerd. Just leave it alone. All right. Anyway, I'm getting mad. I'm sorry. Let's get to training camp day 11. That's more important. That's what you care about. Training camp day 11, some news and notes for you there. A lot of 2-minute drill work as well as some other things. One little tidbit, Quan Alexander got in on some drills on Tuesday. Not any contact or anything like that, but you see the acclimation process continuing to progress. Good news there. Some good stuff from Caden Ellis and Andrew Dowell, who got some nickel snaps with first team, getting some work with that. Chase Hansen getting in the mix in there, of course, as well as your guys, Pete Werner and Zach Bond. The big news, though, comes down to the quarterbacks. Of course, this is where we always come back to. Jameis Winston had the opportunity after a big Monday to keep the momentum going into Tuesday, and unfortunately could not do that. Threw an interception, not entirely his fault, got batted at the line of scrimmage and then intercepted by Paulson Adebo, somebody that we talked about has continued to stand out. However, despite that interception, we did see Jameis Winston lead a 2-minute drill down the field and lead it to a field goal. However, Taysom Hill apparently looked really good in 2-minute drills. Remember, this is one of the things that we talked about. Can Taysom Hill run the 2-minute drill? It rhymes, therefore you know that I'm really into it. It was one of the big things that we talked about needing to see after the 4 games and the emergency quarterback situation that we saw last year with the emergency quarterback game plan, which didn't feel like it had a hurry-up offense. So knowing that they're working on this hurry-up offense and that Taysom ended up closing that out with a touchdown is really, really good news. So now Taysom getting a big day. They continue to be neck and neck in the midst of all this. So really, I think it's just going to come down to the preseason games. If I'm being completely honest, I really think it's going to come down to the preseason games here. Do want to give a shout out to Juwan Johnson. If you're watching on YouTube, I'm going to do this because this is me eating my words when it comes to Juwan Johnson. For those of you that don't know, for those of you listening on the podcast side, I just made little things with my hands and made it look like I was eating strawberries, little strawberry flavored words of you idiot, Ross. Of course, Juwan Johnson was going to be a good tight end, but truly it's taken me by surprise in the best way possible. 4 touchdowns over the last 2 days, red zone and 2-minute drill. A couple of moments that honestly are made for his build. So glad to see that. All right. Now to wrap it up, want to end on this little piece of news here. 2 players left early from training camp day 11 on Tuesday, and they're both in the trenches. Andrus Peat as well as Peyton Turner. Both of these guys have had good camps so far. You don't hear Andrus Peat's name, which is exactly what you want from the offensive line when it comes to training camp. And then Peyton Turner has had a great training camp so far and is another one of those young rookies that has continued to come along maybe a little bit quicker than people anticipated. And so I'm worried about this because I want these guys to be okay, because the offensive line and defensive line, particularly the edge rusher position, is like all this team feels like I feel like they have left at this point, this poor team with all the players that it's lost everywhere along the roster. So fingers crossed that this is brief and that they walked off and that they've taken care of themselves, and maybe they'll be away for a couple of practices and then they'll get back. Getting Peyton Turner back before the Baltimore Ravens game would be great, though, because you would like to see him and some of that preseason action, the young rookie. So just we'll continue to update there. I'm sorry I don't have more information at this time, but we'll see exactly how long, if at all, these players end up being out. Hopefully, again, it's just a short-term thing, kind of like Deontay Harris's early exit days ago ended up being, and less like Traquan Smith, who still hasn't returned to practice just yet. So, all right, y'all, that is going to wrap it up for today's episode. Fingers crossed for a headline-free Wednesday, so that Wednesday night I can finally sit down and record the segment that I want to do and talk about Quan Alexander and talk about the numbers. I want to do it. I want to get to it. I might just do it anyway. And then, of course, we'll keep you up to date with everything going on in camp, and we'll start to look ahead to the preseason. New Orleans Saints are going to be utilizing the first 3 games of the preseason games 1, 2, and 3, the way that they would typically utilize preseason games 1, 2, and 3 during the standard 4-game preseason. So as opposed to the final game of the preseason this year being kind of this throwaway game, or not throwaway game, but bottom of the roster game, looks like it's going to be more of a dress rehearsal, just like the 3rd game of a regular preseason sort of cadence would be. Saints claim that they're going to use Wednesday after practice to talk a little bit about how they're going to start to divvy up these snaps and who's going to get that first rep at quarterback. I still think it's going to be Taysom Hill to start off, just out of respect for seniority. But it does mean that 3rd preseason game may be a good indicator of what the quarterback situation is going to be on Wednesday. So we'll talk about some of the players that are going to be able to stand out during the preseason. And then on Friday, I want to do something different. I want to do kind of keys to victory, but not keys to victory about the game against the Baltimore Ravens, but specific keys to victory about certain bubble players on the roster in terms of what they need to do to impress. So it's keys to victory on an individual level. You have anything you want to contribute to that, make sure that you hit me up on Twitter at RossJacksonNola. And of course, you can also drop them in the comments on YouTube as well. And if you're on the podcast, you can drop them over on iTunes and a 5-star review if you'd like to do that. That would be very much appreciated as we continue the grind here every Monday through Friday here on Locked On Saints. We'll be back with you tomorrow for everything in between, though. Make sure you catch me on Twitter at RossJacksonNola. Hit me up. Let me know how the family's doing. Let me know how you're living. Let me know how you're momming them. And trust to that nation. I'll holla at you.